Kissing can be a pretty innocuous gesture between two people who love each other, but a kiss can also hold a lot of gravitas and drama. No one can do the second kind of kiss like in Hollywood. In fact, movies can get us so wrapped in a love story that we don't notice things about the couple. This video is all about making you notice something uncomfortable about some of these couples: the age gaps. We're starting with a big swing with Harold and Maude. The dark comedy flick from 1971 isn't on too many greatest movies of all time lists, but it has a cult following because it wears its heart on its sleeve as it explores some tough topics about life and death. This is, after all, a movie about Harold, a 20-something trying to find a creative way to kill himself. He falls in love with Maude, an older woman who has a thing for replanting trees from the city to the forest. Now, there's nothing wrong with a couple in which the guy is younger than the girl. After all, the other way around has been a norm for centuries. What might be a little stunning is that actors Bud Cort and Ruth Gordon were 52 years apart. This isn't a May-December romance, this is a May-next May romance.
Harold Chasen.
Oh, how do you do? I'm Dame Marjorie Chardin, but you may call me Maude.
How do you do? Nice to meet you.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to be great friends, don't you?
Next, we have another shocker coming to you with Poison Ivy. Now, Poison Ivy was a 1992 erotic thriller. If that wasn't clear from the name, you'd expect this movie to push some boundaries, and its plot certainly did. At the center of the story is a deranged girl named Ivy who seduces Daryl, the dad of her best friend, in order to become part of their family. Ivy is willing to kill Daryl's wife to make this happen. Now, considering the plot of the movie, you might be surprised to learn that the age gap between Daryl and Ivy's actors was just 41 years apart. But the real thriller in this story is that Ivy was portrayed by Drew Barrymore, who was just 17 years old at the time. Daryl, meanwhile, was played by 58-year-old Tom Skerritt. Age gaps can be okay between consenting adults, but Barrymore's age in this movie really makes this a relic of the bad old days of Hollywood.
I'm always out of place, especially here. Your home is really beautiful, and Coop's the first girl I've met in the city that I can talk to.
Our next movie, Entrapment, tones things down a bit. Sean Connery has some great genes, and the guy barely looks his age. Back in the 90s, this gave him the advantage of scoring leading roles in action movies, even though the actor was in his late 60s. Now, the trouble with this is that action movies usually have young women as their leading ladies. Of course, it's only trouble for us in 2022. Back in the 90s, it was no big deal casting 29-year-old Catherine Zeta-Jones alongside Connery. At 68 years old, Connery was doing a pretty great job of all the action movie stuff, scaling skyscrapers, breaking into vaults, and smooching his 29-year-old lead. He did it all without making the audience feel weird about any of it. It's only odd in hindsight, and it's the sort of thing you'd hope wouldn't happen in this day and age.
I jumped trains mid-station. When the train slowed down, it was perfect.
Was it now?
We'll move on now to the rom-com Something's Gotta Give. A list like this was bound to run into the romantic comedy genre at some point, and it'll do so more than once. Our first rom-com today stars the legendary Jack Nicholson, who mined his massive star power for all it had to give. Like in the Entrapment example, that led him to star in many movies with younger actresses. Nicholson plays Harry, an older man who sleeps around with younger women as a way of staying young. Though he eventually settles down with Diane Keaton's Erica, who is more than the right age for Harry, we must first push through his romance with Amanda Peet. At 31 years old, she was 35 years younger than Nicholson at the time. Up next is Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation. This is a classic film that comes to us from the camera of Francis Ford Coppola's daughter, who herself abandoned an acting career for a life in the chair. Lost in Translation found its way into the hearts of audiences and critics in 2003, which also makes it the newest movie on this list so far. About the only knock you could have on this film is that it ends with 52-year-old Bill Murray smooching with a 17-year-old Scarlett Johansson. That's right, you thought that this sort of thing would have ended with the Poison Ivy era of the 90s, but it lasted a good while longer than that. What makes it worse is that the kiss was improvised on set by Murray himself. As allegations of abuse and harassment have been piling up against Murray, this story feels a lot worse in hindsight. It may well taint the legacy of this cinema classic.
Hi.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thought I'd missed you.
We're following that up with Blame It on Rio. It might be hard to believe that there was ever a time when Michael Caine was young, but it is true that Caine was doing romantic movies like Blame It on Rio in 1984. Of course, that was far from a golden age in Caine's career, as the actor was in his 50s and going through something of a flop era. Blame It on Rio had a lot of problems, but one of the biggest ones was that it cast the 50-something Michael Caine opposite Michelle Johnson, who was just 17 at the time. The movie really underlines the uncomfortableness of this fact by including tons of flirty and sexually charged scenes, not to mention the actual sex scenes. You're supposed to laugh it all off, but that can be hard to do. The late great Roger Ebert skewered this movie, writing that it has the mind of a 1940s bongo comedy and the heart of a porno film. It's really unsettling to see how casually this movie takes a serious situation. Good thing Kane has made up for it with his partnership with Christopher Nolan.
Last night it finally happened. We lay in the sand together, my body next to his. My legs, his legs, each of us the other. What's his name? What's his name?
The next movie is the pretty recent Third Person. In a list where we've looked at movies going back to the 70s, 2013 feels like just yesterday, even if it was almost a decade ago. You'd really expect these age gap romances to have died off by the 2010s, but they were still happening here and there. Such was the case in Third Person, a drama by Paul Haggis. Liam Neeson is a modern example of the sort of aging that kept Sean Connery on posters in his 60s. At the age of 60 even, Neeson was cast opposite the 29-year-old Olivia Wilde. Now, Wilde also looks younger than her age, so together, their appearances really put a fine point on the queasiness of their age gap. That, among other things, led the movie to limp to a 25% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. With a worldwide box office gross of just $2 million, the movie was clearly also roundly rejected by audiences, which is something Paul Haggis wasn't used to at the time. Thanks to the fact that no one watched this movie, though, people were able to forget that Liam Neeson kissed someone 32 years younger than him. So, whoops. Let's hop back into the DeLorean for another black and white movie with Love in the Afternoon. By now, you might be getting the sense that age gap romances are just something that Hollywood is willing to roll with, as long as it doesn't look too disturbing on camera. But the story behind 60-something Gary Cooper's makeout session with 28-year-old Audrey Hepburn is actually kinda interesting. See, Gary Cooper had charmed his way into people's hearts throughout his career, but he clearly didn't know when to stop. By the time he was doing Love in the Afternoon, he was quite visibly old, and he legitimately looked like Audrey's dad, which, by age, he very well could have been. That was part of the reason the movie bombed at the box office, even if critics were slightly more generous to it. In his book, On Sunset Boulevard, Billy Wilder also lays the blame for this movie's failure squarely on Cooper's age. He acknowledges that it flopped and says it did so because he got Coop the week he turned old. Of course, we're tempted to point out that Wilder was the one who cast him, but this is old news now. Finally, it's time to talk about Indecent Proposal. This is a pretty popular movie, considering it's an erotic thriller, but it's the silly fun that has let the movie capture audiences' imaginations. Released in 1999, it seems Demi Moore and Woody Harrelson taking on the request of a billionaire Robert Redford. He'll pay them $1 million for a night with Moore's character. Compared to other movies, Indecent Proposal is different because you're supposed to feel uncomfortable. The 26-year age difference is part of what makes the proposal so indecent, and the strangeness of the age gap is supposed to mingle with the chemistry between Moore and Redford in a way that's hot and weird. The combination of these elements clearly resonated with audiences, who got together to hand the studio $266 million in worldwide sales. The takeaway from this might be that a movie that was trying to weird people out with an age difference stopped at a gap of 26 years. Meanwhile, there are movies trying to sell a 52-year age difference as completely normal. That's it for today's video. Which movie age gap grossed you out the most? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.